He took in a starving young orc to watch his son, and she did something nobody expected. There are two kinds of exhaustion in the world. The first is honest exhaustion, the kind that comes after a real day's work, that aches in the muscles and disappears with sleep and a warm meal. That kind of exhaustion is almost beautiful. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The second has no decent name. It's the exhaustion of waking up every single day and doing everything right without feeling anything. Of opening your eyes, seeing the peeling wooden ceiling, hearing your son breathe in the room next door, and thinking, another one, not as gratitude, not as relief, just as observation, another day starting, another day that will need to be crossed. Henry Wolfe knew that second kind better than he knew his own face in the mirror. Goldport woke early, the way all harbour cities do, dependent on the tide, not the sun. The smell arrived before the light, salt, smoked fish, damp wood, and that permanent undercurrent of tar that lodged in the throat and that, after enough years, you stopped noticing. Henry had stopped noticing a lot of things, actually. That the workshop door creaked at the exact same spot every time, that the third step on the staircase had been rotting for 4 months, that he'd been wearing the same work pants since Tuesday. The workshop sat at the back of the house, separated from the living quarters by a stone hallway that sweated moisture in winter and cracked in summer. Net repairs, hull patching, dock plank replacements, invisible work, the kind a city uses every single day and never thanks anyone for. The port of Goldport functioned because there were men like Henry holding things together with resin, nails and stubbornness, but the port didn't know any of their names. He was 32 years old and looked 40, not from lack of care, from excess of weight. Widowhood has a particular way of aging a man, not through sharp pain, which at least announces itself, but through the constant absence of the hand that used to carry half of what you were carrying. Lena had died 18 months ago, a sudden fever that became infection, that became silence in less than a week, too fast to understand, too slow to forget. And she had left behind, along with a bed that was too large, a 6-year-old boy who had begun folding himself inward like wet paper. Thomas. Henry heard his son shifting in the bedroom and walked to the door. The boy was sitting on the floor, not on the bed, because he had decided some time ago that the floor was safer, harder to fall when you were already at the lowest point. He had his mother's dark hair and brown eyes, and a way of watching things, as though he were always calculating the distance between himself and danger. He didn't talk much. Before Lena died, Thomas talked enough for 2. Invented stories, endless questions, the kind of noise that irritates you in the moment and haunts you forever after. Then the words began drying up like a puddle in summer. Now he communicated through gestures, single syllables and long silences that Henry had learned to read but never learned to fix. "Good morning," said Henry. Thomas raised his hand. A small wave. "Morning, Dad." Henry went to make the porridge. The kitchen smelled of soot and fennel. Lena had planted it in a clay pot on the windowsill, and Henry kept watering it without knowing quite why. The porridge was simple. Oats, water, a spoonful of honey when there was honey. He put both bowls on the table and went to call Thomas, who came without being called because he knew the ritual by heart. It was during breakfast that the warning arrived. Not a formal letter. It never was in Goldport. It was Benedito, the harbour contractor's nephew, who knocked with the face of someone delivering bad news on behalf of someone else, and therefore felt no personal responsibility for it. "Mr. Crevero says if you miss one more shift, the contract goes to someone else. 3 weeks with gaps in the schedule doesn't work, Henry." "I know," said Henry. "Just so you know." The door closed. Thomas hadn't lifted his eyes from his bowl. Henry stood in the kitchen for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders like something physical. The harbour contract was the difference between the house and the street. He had missed shifts because the only caregiver he'd managed to find, Mrs. Bertinia, the neighbor 2 houses down, had fallen ill. Before her, he'd tried hiring a boy from the neighborhood, who vanished with the advance payment and one of Henry's tools. Before that, a woman who charged twice what Henry earned in a shift and still looked at Thomas as though the boy was someone else's problem. He needed someone to stay with his son for 6 hours a day, just that, 6 hours, and there was no one, or rather there were people, but none who would accept Thomas the way he was. Quiet. Closed off, strange in the way he didn't respond when you called his name. The boy's not right, Henry had overheard once in the bakery, spoken low. He had swallowed that the way he swallowed everything since Lena left, teeth clenched, chest anesthetized. That morning, as the rain began to hammer the workshop's tin roof, Henry Wolfe was one step away from losing the only thread still holding his life in place. And he didn't yet know that the rain was about to bring him the most unexpected thing a city like Goldport could offer a man like him. Not a solution, a person. Rain in Goldport doesn't fall. It arrives, there is a difference. Rain that falls has lightness, the illusion of being temporary. Goldport's rain is dense, horizontal when the sea wind blows, and it gives no warning and asks no permission. It is simply there suddenly, turning the cobblestone streets into shallow rivers, and the smell of salt into something heavier, almost suffocating. The fishermen called it anchor rain, the kind that pins you down. Henry had gone to buy resin at the covered market before the weather closed in entirely and had failed. He came out with the parcel in his hand, his hat soaked through, and the feeling that the day had decided not to cooperate. It was on the way back, in the narrow alley between the back of the market and the grain warehouse wall, that he saw her. She had her back against the wall, so still that the first reading of the eye was object, not person. Something leaned there, waiting to be removed. Only when Henry passed within 10 feet and his vision adjusted did he understand what he was seeing. A young woman sitting on the muddy ground, knees pulled to her chest, hands tucked under her arms as though she were trying to make them disappear. Green, a greyish-green skin that the rain had made darker, more visible against the peeling white wall behind her. Long, pointed ears tilted slightly to the sides, the posture of someone who had learned that attracting less attention was a matter of survival. Small tusks, almost discreet, barely visible because her lips were pressed firmly shut. And when she sensed she was being watched and raised her head for just a second before lowering it again. The eyes, gold, deep, with that amber gleam that orcs have, and that the people of Goldport insisted on calling a beast's stare, because calling it beautiful would cost something they weren't willing to pay. She was thin in a way that frightened. Not the thinness of someone who doesn't take care of themselves, the thinness of someone who hasn't eaten in days. Prominent shoulders under a canvas shirt that had once been grey and was now something else entirely, hollow cheeks, a thin wrist that appeared for just a moment when she shifted her weight, the kind of body that was running on its last reserves. She didn't ask for anything. That was the detail that made Henry stop completely. He knew beggars. Goldport had plenty on the harbour corners, outside the tavern. He knew the gesture, the appeal, the extended hand, or the calculated gaze that measures whether you look like the kind of person who gives. She did none of that. She didn't look at him like an opportunity. She looked the way someone looks who has been through so many things that they've given up expecting other people to be anything other than walking danger. She was waiting for the rain to pass. Or perhaps not even that. Perhaps she was simply existing there, in the only corner the wall offered as shelter, waiting for the world to keep ignoring her as it had until now. Henry stood in the rain for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the practical part of his brain, the same part that calculated timber loads and rope tensile strength in meters, ran the quick arithmetic. He needed someone today, now. The shift started at 2 in the afternoon, and it was 11 in the morning. He'd tried 3 more names this week, 1 refusal, 1 laugh, 1 absurd price. His son was home alone because Mrs. Bertigna had sent word she was still in bed. He wasn't looking for an orc. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular. He was looking for a solution, and he had found a person. And in that moment, his tired brain placed the 2 things in the same sentence. "Hey," he said. She didn't respond, stayed still. "I'm not here to hurt you," he continued. And he was aware of how stupid that sounded said out loud, but kept going because there was no more honest way to put it. "I have a practical problem. I need someone to stay with my son this afternoon for 6 hours. There's food at the house and a dry place to stay. I'll pay at the end of the shift, that's all, nothing else." She raised her head slowly. Those gold eyes moved over him from top to bottom with the specific speed of someone who learned to read threat before they learned to read anything else. Mouth, hands, posture, calculating. "Why me?" The voice came out rough, not from emotion, from disuse. "Because you're here and I don't have anyone else to ask," said Henry. And there was something in that brutal honesty that was more respectful than any generous speech could have been. Silence. The rain hit the wall, ran down the drain pipe, fell in curtain from the edge of the market roof above them. "My son is 6, he added. "He's not easy. He doesn't talk much. You don't need to do anything special. Just be there and make sure he doesn't hurt himself. I'll be back by 8. She looked at him for a long moment, then looked at her own hands, still hidden under her arms, then closed her eyes for 2 seconds, as though consulting something internal that had no name, and opened them. "If I get there, and it's a trap," she said, slow, each word placed with care, "I walk out." "Fine," said Henry. "And I don't touch anything in your house." "Fine. And if the boy doesn't want my presence, I stay quiet in a corner and don't push." "Even better," said Henry. And something about that last condition was so precise, so exactly right for Thomas specifically, that Henry felt something strange. The sensation that she had understood something about his son without ever having seen him. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a moment before shaking it, firm, quick, the way you sign a contract, not the way you make a friend. "Myella," she said. "Henry." And that was how it was, with no miracle and no particular kindness, without music and without destiny. That was how, in the anchor rain of Goldport, 2 strangers made the simplest and most complicated agreement of their lives. The house smelled of fennel and wood that never dried right. Myella noticed that before she noticed anything else, the smell. Then she noticed the ceiling height. Low for her, who stood nearly 6 feet without counting her ears, and who had long ago learned to move slightly hunched in human spaces to avoid hitting her head and drawing attention. Then she noticed the work table with 3 folded nets waiting to be repaired, the tools hanging on the wall by size, the breadboard with still fresh crumbs and a forgotten coffee cup cooling on the edge. A man's house, with a son, with exhaustion in every corner. She knew that smell. Not this specific house, but the type. Places where people do everything they can, and the dust still builds in the corners because there's no time left, even for that. Henry had done what he said, shown her where the kitchen was, where the emergency bathroom was in the hallway, where the son was. Then he picked up his tool bag, said, "There's bread and cheese in the pantry, help yourself," and left. No speech, no list of rules, no looking back 3 times. She had stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, waiting for the trap. Nothing happened. Then she turned toward the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, and found 2 brown eyes looking at her through the gap. When the eyes realized they'd been seen, they disappeared. The door clicked softly shut. Myella stayed where she was. She didn't go to the door, didn't call out, didn't say, "Hi, you can open up, I'm a friend," because she wasn't a friend. They were strangers, and children who had learned to be afraid of the world tended to know the difference between truth and performance better than most adults. Instead, she went to the kitchen, looked through the pantry, found the bread and cheese Henry had mentioned, and also found a piece of smoked bacon nearly gone, 3 potatoes beginning to sprout, dried herbs hanging that she recognized as thyme and basil, and, at the bottom of a wooden crate, a roll of thick twine and several pieces of woven cloth, scraps, most likely from the workshop. She took the twine and the cloth and went to sit on the living room floor. Not in the chair. On the floor, back against the wall that faced the hallway leading to the bedroom, at a distance that wasn't threatening, but was visible. If the boy opened the door, he would see her, but he'd have enough space to not feel cornered. Myella began to fold. It was something she had learned from her grandmother. Maella's hands were never idle as a child, because her grandmother said empty hands invite heavy thoughts. With the twine and the cloth scraps, she began to build a 3-legged frame of twine, a folded cloth body, 2 loop ears, a tail, small, imperfect, odd, a fox. Then a second figure, taller, a lopsided bear, then something that was half rabbit, half nothing in particular. There was no apparent logic. She wasn't putting on a show, wasn't being pedagogical. She was simply doing what she did when she needed to occupy her hands and let the world exist around her without demanding anything from it. The bedroom door opened 1 inch. Myella didn't look up. She kept folding. The fox got 1 ear longer than the other, an imperfection she left on purpose, because perfectly symmetrical things are frightening when you're still learning to trust. The door opened a little more. She heard the footsteps, light, calculated, the kind a child makes when trying not to be heard, but also needing to hear what was happening outside. He stopped about 6 feet from Myella. She felt the weight of the stare, but didn't return it. She placed the fox in the line, beside the bear and the rabbit thing, and picked up another piece of cloth. "This one's going to be a fish," she said, in a low voice, to no one in particular. "But I'm not very good at fish. It'll come out crooked." Silence. "Everything I make comes out crooked," she continued, same tone. "My grandmother said it was because I was too impatient, but I don't think that's it. I think crooked things have more history. Nothing. But the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of someone ready to run. It was the silence of someone who was listening. The fish came out with its tail bent the wrong way. She set it in the line, then she felt it. The floor gave slightly, a small weight settling down about 3 feet away. She didn't turn her head. She just shifted her field of vision, peripheral, subtle, and saw Thomas, sitting cross-legged 3 feet away from her, looking at the row of figures with an expression she knew well. Not happiness, recognition. This is safe. They sat like that in silence for maybe 20 minutes, her making figures, him watching, neither one demanding anything from the other. And then, slowly, with a carefulness that seemed enormous for such a small gesture, Thomas reached out and picked up the fox. Myella kept folding the next piece of cloth, but inside, in that space she had learned to keep closed because life had taught her that hope was a dangerous luxury. Inside, something that had been quiet for a very long time stirred awake and sat there the way she was sitting, watching and waiting. Not happiness yet, recognition. This might be safe. It didn't happen in a day. It happened in layers, like varnish over old wood. It doesn't cover all at once, doesn't transform all at once, but with each coat the wood becomes a little less exposed, a little less brittle to the touch. You have to let it dry between coats. You have to have patience for what cannot be rushed. Henry began watching Myella without her knowing, or perhaps she knew and allowed it, because there was something about this man that was different from the other humans who had crossed her path. He didn't pretend not to look while looking. When he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stayed 3-4 seconds longer than necessary, it was a direct gaze, no pretense of indifference. "I'm watching. I'm not judging yet. I'm trying to understand." She could work with that. The morning ritual had been born on the third day, almost by accident. Thomas woke with a troubled stomach. Myella had noticed this on the very first day. The way the boy arrived in the kitchen in the morning with his brow creased and the posture of someone negotiating with his own body. She had asked Henry in passing whether his son had a history of digestive problems. Henry had said, with the voice of someone remembering something he'd forgotten to mention, "Since his mother died, the doctor said it's anxiety that goes to the stomach. He can't eat anything heavy in the morning." The next morning, Myella had prepared the porridge differently. Not oats. She had found at the back of the pantry a packet of ground grain that Henry had probably bought without being entirely sure what it was. Fine cornmeal, almost flour, with water, milk from the neighbour that Myella had obtained in exchange for mending a hole in a fence. She had done this quietly early in the morning without telling anyone. Honey, and a pinch of ginger she'd borrowed from the herbalist 2 streets down. The result was a porridge the colour of sunlight, warm, smelling of the kind of thing that settles you. Thomas had looked at the bowl with suspicion. Myella had placed the bowl on the table and walked out of the kitchen because she had learned that children who had been hurt needed space to make their own choices without feeling watched. When she came back 5 minutes later, the bowl was half empty. The next day, empty. The breathing ritual came later in the second week, during an episode that Myella had witnessed, and that confirmed what she already suspected. Thomas had no words for when things became too much. When something locked, a loud noise, a break in routine, a question he couldn't answer. He entered a containment loop, shoulders rising, fists closing, breathing short, the look of someone trying to disappear inside themselves. It was the kind of thing that made panicked adults yell, "Breathe, calm down, look at me," which is, for a child in that state, essentially pouring fuel on an ember. Myella had done differently. She had moved close to Thomas, not touching, but within a hand's reach, and said low and steady her own name, "Myella, Myella, Myella," like an anchor, not a command. And then, very slowly, she had taken a long, visible breath herself, chest rising, pausing, falling, and repeated it 3 times, without requiring that he do the same. On the third breath, he had copied her. Without realizing, he was copying. The episode had lasted less than 2 minutes. The 3-knock ritual had actually been his idea, or at least his reaction that she had turned into ritual. In the 3rd week, Thomas had panicked when Myella entered his room without warning. She had gone to retrieve a blanket that had fallen. He had thrown himself behind the bed, eyes wide, the kind of reaction that came from somewhere much deeper than that particular room. Myella had walked out, knocked on the door, knock, 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 3 knocks, and said from the hallway, "It's me, Myella. Can I come in?" Silence. And then Thomas's voice. Thin, but there, yes. After that, the 3 knocks became code. Before entering any room where Thomas was, she knocked 3 times and waited. Sometimes he answered out loud. Sometimes it was a knock from the other side of the wall. Sometimes it was simply the fact of the door being unlocked. He chose to let you in. That was what the 3 knocks said, every single time. Henry had arrived in the 5th week at the wrong time. The shift had ended early due to a minor accident on the dock, and found the following scene: Myella and Thomas sitting on the living room floor, the cloth figures spread between them, and Thomas talking. Not much, not in long sentences, but talking, describing the cloth animals by the names he had given each one. The fox was called Sun. The lopsided bear was Chubby, a name chosen with evident great satisfaction. The rabbit thing was simply him, for reasons Thomas hadn't explained and Myella hadn't asked about. Henry stood in the doorway for a long time. Myella saw him first. She always saw things first, and for a moment their eyes met. She said nothing. He said nothing either. But there was something in that silence that was different from the tired silence that had filled that house for the past 18 months. It was the silence of someone watching something they had stopped expecting to see. Later, after Thomas had gone to bed, Henry went to the kitchen and stood at the edge of the sink for a moment before asking, without looking at Myella directly, "What did you do to him?" "Nothing," she said. "It's not nothing. I know my son." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I did what any person should do. I asked what he needed without expecting him to know how to answer in words, and then I stayed quiet and let him show me." Henry nodded. He put his cup in the sink, stood there a moment longer. "Thank you," he said, simply. She didn't answer. But that night she slept in the storage room with the blanket Henry had left folded on the wooden chair, and for the first time in a long time she didn't sleep with one ear open, waiting for the sound of footsteps that carry trouble. She slept whole. Harbour cities have long memories and short mercy. Goldport had always tolerated orcs the way it tolerated bad weather, as inevitability, not as choice. There had been orcs in the harbour for generations, cargo carriers, hull repairers, the heavy work that no one else wanted. There were orcs in the taverns, in the stables, in the slaughterhouse yards, in their places, doing their things, visible when they were useful and invisible when they were not. An orc in a human's home, caring for a human child, was something else. Not illegal. There was no written law. But there was the other kind of law, the kind that exists in the looks through windows, in the pauses in conversation when someone passes, in the fact that the baker begins making change errors without quite meaning to every time you walk in. The first thing was Mrs. Carmeline, from the house across the street, who stopped Henry with the tight-lipped gentleness of someone being vigilant out of kindness. "Henry, it's none of my business, but people are talking. That you left an orc alone inside the house with the boy. That she was seen talking to Teresa at the herbalist, asking for herbs. Nobody knows where she came from or what she wants here." "She works for me," said Henry. I know. It's just that people—" Mrs. Carmeline made the universal gesture of, "What can I do if people are like this?" which is the most cowardly way to agree with people without taking responsibility for agreeing. "The boy already has such difficulties. Imagine if something happened." Henry walked away without answering. The second thing was Albert, owner of the hardware store on the Harbour Alley, who had been a contract neighbour for 6 years and decided he'd found the right moment for a man-to-man talk, hand on Henry's shoulder, the tone of someone who'd seen a lot. "I'm not saying she's dangerous. I'm saying an orc with a child is something that can't end well. It's nature, you understand. No malice, but they're different instincts. And if anything happens to Thomas, the blame falls on you, not her." "Nothing is going to happen to Thomas," said Henry. "All right," said Albert, in the voice of someone who considers the matter settled by its own logic. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." The third thing was the hardest. Guard Pasco, tall, with a moustache he cultivated as identity, had stopped in front of the house one afternoon and knocked with the butt of his lance, not his hand. A signal of authority, not a visit. Myella was inside with Thomas. Henry had arrived 15 minutes earlier and still had his bag on his shoulder when he opened the door. "Here on protocol," said Pasco. "Report of suspicious activity. Mrs. Bernadette from number 8 says she saw the orc at the window at night, looking out at the street." "She was looking at the street because she was awake," said Henry, "same as any person." "With an orc in your house, Henry, anything that happens, an accident, an incident, anything will be investigated, and the responsibility will be yours. Not a threat, just how it works." "I know how it works," said Henry, and there was something in his voice that made Pasco take a half step back, involuntary. The guard left. Henry closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. From Thomas's room came the sound of 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Myella's voice low, "You can sleep, I'll stay here a little longer." Thomas's voice tiny but present, "Okay." Henry went to the kitchen and stood facing the sink for a long time. The question wasn't whether Myella was dangerous. He knew she wasn't. The way you know when you watch something closely for weeks, when you see someone deal with your child the way she dealt with Thomas, when you understand that the patience she had with him wasn't performance, it was constitution. It was who she was. The question was the cost. In Goldport, social cost was as real as financial debt. Contracts could be broken over reputation. Clients could vanish over a rumor. The harbor's trust, the only thread keeping the house, depended on Crevero. And Crevero was the kind of man who read the city's wind before making any decision. If Goldport decided that Henry Wolfe had become a problem, Henry Wolfe would become a problem. Simple as that. That night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, running the calculation that had no clean answer. On one side, the house, the contract, the minimal stability Thomas needed. On the other, the only thing that had given his son anything resembling a presence in the world. There was no easy answer. And then, in the morning, while he was drinking his coffee and trying not to think, Myella set 2 bowls of cornmeal porridge on the table, without comment. One for Thomas, one for him. He looked at her. "You know people are talking," he said. "They always have," she said, simply, and she went to sit and eat without drama, without asking him to fix anything. Henry drank his coffee, ate the porridge, and understood, with a clarity he hadn't wanted to arrive so soon, that Goldport's problem had stopped being abstract. It was about to knock on the door with considerably more force than any guard. He arrived on a clear sky morning, which is the worst time for bad things to arrive, because you don't have the excuse of bad weather for not having seen them coming. Henry was in the workshop when he heard the different noise in the street. Not the everyday noise of the harbour waking up, but the specific noise of a group of people moving with purpose, with the wrong cadence for merchants or fishermen. He stepped out to look. There were 4 of them. 3 male orcs, large, with the kind of posture that comes not from size, but from practice, the way of moving that belongs to someone who has spent years deciding when to use force. Armed, not heavily, but visibly. And at the front, 1 step ahead of the group, an older orc, not taller than the others, but with a different quality to his face. Organized scars, not accidental ones, and the eyes of someone who had learned very early that the world was a logistics problem. Ragorn. Henry didn't know the name yet. He learned it after, but he recognized the type. The harbour city was full of them, human and orc alike. The kind of man who had turned hunting into a trade, and the trade into an identity, until he no longer knew who he was when he wasn't pursuing something. They stopped in front of the house. Henry went to the workshop door and stood there without advancing. "Can I help you?" he said, in the flat tone of someone who asks without wanting the answer. "You're Henry Wolfe?" The older orc spoke without taking his eyes off the house. "Owner of this property?" "I am." "You're sheltering an orc named Maela, daughter of Kren, of the scattered Aldvar clan." "Not a question." "I have an employee named Myella," said Henry. "The rest is none of your business." Ragorn turned his head slowly until he was looking at Henry with those eyes that always seemed to be finishing a calculation. "She's the subject of a blood debt pact still in force. She fled its fulfillment. I'm here to return her." "Return her where?" "To those who hold the right over her." Henry looked at him for a moment, then, "Nobody holds any right over her on this property." "Orc law disagrees," said Ragorn. "We're in Goldport. Orc law isn't what governs here." There was a silence. Then Ragorn made a small gesture with his hand. Not threatening, deliberately not threatening, the kind of gesture that says for now, think carefully, human. You have nothing to gain in this story, and quite a lot to lose. They left. Henry went back inside. Myella was in the kitchen, standing with her hand on the sink edge, her back to him. She had heard everything. She didn't turn when he entered. "How long did you know they were coming?" he asked. "I knew it was a matter of time." Her voice was too steady to mean she was fine. "I left a trace when I got herbs from the herbalist. They have trackers. What is the blood debt pact?" She was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should. "My father took on a debt before he died," she said finally, still not turning. "A debt that by clan law passes to descendants if not repaid. Whoever bought the debt has the right to demand service, the kind of service you don't choose and doesn't end when you want it to. I fled because the alternative was worse than anything I could imagine." Silence. "You could have told me," said Henry. "You hired me to watch your son, not to bring my problems into your house." She turned then, and on that face was the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to carry it out. "I'm leaving tonight, before they come back." Henry opened his mouth, and then said nothing, because at that exact moment he heard light footsteps in the hallway. Thomas, awake early, coming down to breakfast before his usual time. The boy entered the kitchen, saw the two of them, read something in the atmosphere that sensitive children read before they understand it, and went straight to Myella, took her hand in both of his small ones, and stood there. Myella looked at Thomas's hand in hers, closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the gold eyes were bright with something she hadn't let be bright for a long time, and that she immediately tried to put back. Henry went to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked out the window at the empty street without seeing anything. He stayed that way until he remembered, went to the drawer of the nightstand where he kept Thomas's things that were too small for the boy's room, and found what he had seen days ago and that had stayed in his mind without being able to leave. A small amulet, cloth sewn with thick thread, with a symbol embroidered that he had asked the blacksmith Gorveth at the harbour about. What it meant. Gorveth had said, without lifting his eyes from the anvil, "Guard. It's the orc symbol for protector. Whoever makes it and gives it commits to not leaving the other unprotected." Henry held the amulet for a long time, then got up and went back to the kitchen. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Maela was rolling her belongings into her travel blanket, which were few things. The kind of inventory that looks more like a flight situation than an established life. She stopped when she heard Henry's voice in the storage room doorway, but didn't turn immediately. "It's not your decision," she said. "It's not yours either, if you're making it for the wrong reason." She turned then. The gold eyes were dry. She had learned long ago that tears in front of strangers were a luxury that cost more than it was worth. The right reason is not destroying your lives, which is more than anyone I've ever met has done for mine. "The amulet," said Henry. She went still. "I saw Thomas with it. Asked Gorveth what it meant." He took a step inside the storage room, not threatening, just present. "Guard, you sewed that for my son." "It's a custom," she said, controlled voice. "When you spend time with a child, you—" "Myella." She stopped. "You sewed a protection amulet for a boy who has nothing to do with you, with the same twine I use on the nets, at a time when you should have been sleeping after a long day, because you wanted to." Silence. She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that were always calculating exits, and then, slowly, with the kind of movement that looks small on the outside and is enormous on the inside, she went to the floor. She didn't fall. She lowered herself, on her knees, back straight, head slightly inclined, not submission but acknowledgement. It was the gesture of someone raised with a code they still carried even after everything the world had done to that code. With her right hand, she removed the necklace. A thin chain with a pendant of dark green stone, chipped, obviously old, obviously the one object of hers that had survived everything that had needed surviving. She held it out to Henry. "In my clan's culture," she said, voice low and precise, each word carrying the weight of something not said lightly, "when someone gives you shelter without buying you, without using you, without taking more than was agreed, you don't pay with money, you pay with loyalty. And loyalty, in my code, isn't a feeling, it's an action." She kept the necklace extended. "This is the last piece of my family. When you give this to someone, you're saying your life is committed to theirs, not as a servant, as a choice, as a vow." Henry looked at the necklace, looked at her, stood still. "You don't need to do this," he said finally. "I know. That's why it's real." A long silence. The candle flame in the corner of the storage room trembled in a draught from the window. "If Ragorn comes back," said Myella, "and if I'm not here, he has no reason to bother you two. I'm the problem. I solve the problem by leaving." "And where will you go?" She didn't answer, because there was nowhere. Henry looked at her for a moment, then lowered her hand, not touching the necklace, pushing her hand back toward her, returning it. "Keep the necklace." She looked up. "I need to tell you something," said Henry, and it was the first time in a long time that he spoke about Lena without someone asking, about how she had been the person who understood Thomas, the only one who knew how to read their son's silence without turning it into a problem, about how, after she was gone, the boy had become a locked room with no key, about how Henry had tried everything he knew how to try and had gotten nowhere because he loved his son but wasn't the right person to open that particular door. "You are," he said. "I don't know what you did or how, but you are. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't see that because it's more convenient for me." Maela looked at him for a long moment. "You're an idiot," she said, but not with anger, with something that was, perhaps, the most honest way she had of saying thank you. "Probably," said Henry. "But it's the kind of idiot who's going to open the door tomorrow when Ragorn shows up again. So if you have any plan, now is the time to share it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in weeks, the corner of her mouth rose by a millimeter. "I know someone who can settle this," she said, "but it's going to require you to trust an old man who claims to be a blacksmith." Henry processed that. "Gorveth. You already knew." "I suspected something. He knows the symbol." "Gorveth isn't just a blacksmith," said Myella. "He's an elder of the Code Council, one of the last. If he testifies that the blood pact was invoked illegally, which it was, because my father was under coercion when he signed, Ragorn can't touch me. It's the code. He lives and dies by the code. And so does Ragorn." "And so does Ragorn," Henry nodded. "Then tomorrow morning," he said, "we go talk to the old blacksmith." She looked at him, then looked at the necklace in her own hand, closed her fingers around it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not rhetorically, genuinely. "You don't owe me anything. The agreement was food and payment. You've already given that." Henry stood still for a moment, then went to the door on the verge of leaving, turned back. "My son slept with a protection amulet you sewed for him," he said. "That's worth more than any contract I've ever signed." And he left. Myella sat alone in the storage room for a long moment, the necklace closed in her fist, listening to the sounds of the house. The creaking planks, the wind in the eaves, the quiet breathing that came from Thomas's room through the thin walls. Family in her clan's culture was not blood. It was choice. It was who you decided to wake up to protect. She had stopped believing she would ever make that choice again. The morning came with fog and with Ragorn. It wasn't a surprise. Henry had spent much of the night without sleeping running exactly that calculation, and had concluded that men like Ragorn didn't give second deadlines out of kindness. They gave them to appear reasonable while gathering what they needed in order to no longer need deadlines, which meant the window was small, and the conversation with Gorvith had happened early before dawn in the forge, with Myella translating where the elders' language became too dense for Henry's imperfect understanding. Gorvith had listened to everything with the face of someone who already knew everything and had been waiting for someone to bring it to him. An old man with the shoulders of a man who had worked his whole life, deep green, dark, wrinkled skin, amber eyes almost dimmed that were not dimmed at all. When Maela finished, he had been silent for what seemed too long, and then had said in Orc, something she translated for Henry as, "I knew Ragorn would betray the code when he was young. I let it happen because I thought it was his business to sort out. My mistake." Then he had stood up, taken the heavy leather coat that hung behind the forge, and said in deliberate Portuguese with a thick accent, "When they come, you call me." They came at 9 in the morning, at the harbour. While Henry was on the dock edge, waiting for a timber delivery he needed to receive before the day became something else entirely. Ragorn and the 3 men came from the market side. There was already a small crowd, dock workers, merchants, a few neighbours, the kind of gathering that a small city forms when it senses something is about to happen. Because small cities are hungry for events and have no shame about watching, Myella was with Henry. She had insisted on being there, with the implacable logic of someone who knows that hiding was what hadn't worked. "They'll come after me regardless. At least here there are witnesses." Ragorn stopped 10 feet away. His gaze went directly to Myella, not to Henry, as though Henry were part of the scenery. "I gave you time yesterday. Time is up." "I didn't accept the deadline," said Myella. "You didn't need to." Henry took a step forward, not a big step, but a step that placed his body between Ragorn and Maela, and that was clearly the kind of gesture an untrained man makes when he has decided he's going to do this thing even with no idea how it ends. "She stays." Ragorn looked at him with something that wasn't anger. It was worse. It was patience, the kind of patience belonging to someone who has seen this scene many times and knows how it ends. "Human, you don't understand what you're getting into." "I understand," said Henry. "I'm getting in your way. That's going to cost more than you can pay." The crowd around them was quiet with that specific silence that is not neutrality, it is assessment. Let's see. Henry felt the weight of those surrounding eyes as something physical, everyone calculating whether he was a hero or an idiot. The unanimous answer being probably an idiot. He stayed where he was. Ragorn made a gesture. One of the men behind him advanced a step, and then the sound came. Small, high, from a direction nobody expected. From the edge of the crowd, from the direction where Henry had absolutely told Thomas to stay home, had said with all the firmness an exhausted father can gather, had asked Mrs. Bertina to watch him. "Auntie!" Thomas's voice, one word only but enormous, clear as a bell, carrying 6 years of silence and returning all at once, thrown into the middle of Goldport's harbour like a stone in still water. The crowd turned. Thomas was at the edge of the road, feet on the fog-damp stone, looking straight at Myella with an expression that wasn't fear. It was certainty. The kind of certainty children have when they've decided that something matters more than any adult's instruction. Myella stood still for a second, then lowered herself to his level and moved toward him, not running, walking, but with that speed you have when the body moves before the head does. And when she got close, Thomas threw his arms around her neck with that specific force of a 6-year-old that is all the force that exists. The crowd went silent. And then something happened that Henry had never predicted and would spend years thinking about. The crowd didn't turn on Ragorn with anger. The crowd looked at Thomas holding on to Myella and went quiet in the way people go quiet when they see something they know is real, and that dismantles the narrative they were ready to believe. There was no spell there. There was a child who had chosen where to stay. Ragorn stood watching the scene for a moment, and it was then, when he advanced anyway, his hand reaching for Myela's arm, the intent clear, that the voice came. Ragorn, son of no one, carrier of a false pact. Gorveth had emerged from the market side, with the leather coat and the blacksmith's hammer still in his hand, not as a weapon, but as an extension of who he was. He walked slowly because he didn't need to walk fast. He had the kind of authority that doesn't use hurry. Ragorn's hand stopped in mid-air. "Elder," said Ragorn, and for the first time there was something different in that voice. Not exactly fear, but recognition of a limit. "The blood pact you carry was registered under coercion. I saw it. I was there." Gorveth's voice was low, steady, with the heavy accent of the north. "You know that a pact made under coercion has no validity in the code. You know this." "The council doesn't—" "I am the council." Gorveth stopped 2 yards from Ragorn. "The others are dead or scattered. I am what remains. And I say the pact has no value." Silence. Ragorn looked at Myella, at Gorveth, at Henry, at Thomas still clutching Myela's neck. He ran the slow calculation of someone who has lost and is deciding how to lose without destroying the reputation needed for the next job. "You'll be seeing me again," he said to Myella. "Perhaps," she said, "but not today." Ragorn turned and walked away with his 3 men. And the crowd parted to let them through with the collective relief of someone who didn't have to choose a side and was glad about it. Henry exhaled. Thomas was still holding on to Myella. She had her eyes closed, face buried in his hair, doing that thing she did when he locked up. Long, visible breaths, 3 times. But now doing it for herself. Gorveth passed Henry and said in passing without stopping as though making a note, "She's a good person. Take care of her right." "I will," said Henry. The elder walked back to the forge. The harbour went back to being a harbour, and Henry stood in the morning fog, watching his son holding on to the woman who had arrived starving in the rain and had become, without anyone planning it, without anyone asking, without anyone knowing it was possible, the thing the house had needed to have sound inside it again. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep with the cloth fox sun pressed to his chest and the guard amulet at his neck, Myella left a notebook on the kitchen table. It wasn't a real notebook. It was sheets folded in half and sewn together with the same twine she used for the cloth figures. The cover made of waxed paper she had asked for at the market in exchange for a basket repair she had done for nothing a week earlier. Inside were pages filled with a handwriting that mixed human letters written with visible effort and orc symbols drawn with the confidence you have when you're in your own language. Henry stood looking at the notebook for a long time before opening it. The first page said, in an applied hand of someone who had learned to write in this language and still negotiated with it, sentence by sentence. For Thomas, things that help. There were sections, not with formal titles, but with drawings in the margins that worked as dividers. A section with illustrations of the cloth animals and the names Thomas had given them. Son the fox, Chubby the bear, him the rabbit thing. Beside each figure, notes in small writing about what each represented for the boy. Not clinical psychology, but the observation of someone who had spent weeks paying attention without him knowing she was watching. Son, holds it when going to sleep. If it disappears under the blanket during the night, don't remove. He hides it on purpose. Chubby, uses it when he wants to ask for food without speaking. If he puts the bear on the table, he's hungry. Him. Appears when Thomas is scared but doesn't want to admit it. Don't ask about him directly. Just let him be there. A section with the routines. The 3 moments of the day that Thomas needed to be the same every day. Not because he was rigid, but because the sameness was what left him energy to handle the different. Breakfast before any conversation. Don't ask how he slept before the porridge. He answers questions better after his stomach is settled. A section with the 3-knock ritual, described in detail, including the variation that had emerged in the last few weeks, when Thomas sometimes responded with 2 knocks instead of a verbal yes, and what each variation meant. A section with the signs that the day was becoming too much. The right shoulder rises before the left. When this happens, it's time to lower the noise. Don't ask what's wrong. He can't name it yet. Just lower the noise. A section with recipes. Simple, approximate measurements. With notes alongside like the neighbor Faye's milk is richer. Use less. And the ginger has to be the old dried kind. The fresh is too strong. And on the last page, alone, in a slightly larger hand than the rest, the writing of someone going slowly to not make a mistake, because this mattered too much for mistakes. I owe you my life. But your son, he gave me back my soul. Henry stood in the kitchen with the notebook open for a time he couldn't measure. Outside, Goldport slept with its usual noise, the sea hitting the dock, a distant dog, the familiar creak of a boat hull adjusting to the tide, sounds he had learned not to hear and that now, somehow, were arriving back. He had hired a babysitter. He had gone to that alley behind the market, looking for a practical solution to a practical problem. Someone to stay with his son for 6 hours, who wouldn't steal, who wouldn't hurt him, who wouldn't be one more problem in a week, already full of them. He had made the cold calculation of someone who has no margin for kindness, but had margin for desperation, and he had received this. There was no word for what Myella had done with Thomas. Care was too small. Heal was too presumptuous because Thomas wasn't healed. He was better, which is different and more honest. Guard was the closest, because it was what the symbol said, and it was what she had truly done. Guarded the boy, in the sense that means not letting anything essential be lost while the hard thing is happening. And there was something more that Henry took time to name. She had guarded something of him too, without asking permission, without ceremony, just by being a steady presence in the house that had been too quiet for too long, making porridge in the morning, knocking 3 times before entering, folding cloth figures on the floor with the same concentration he brought to repairing nets. Returning to that space, the feeling that there was more than one person keeping the house running. He had forgotten what that felt like. Henry closed the notebook, went to the window, looked at the fog-wet street, the dark houses, the harbour lighthouse turning slow in the back of the night. Ragorn would return. That he knew, not if, but when. When the man reorganized his argument, found another gap in the code, or simply decided the humiliation was worth more than the law. The port of Goldport would keep being Goldport's port, tolerant to the degree of the useful, hostile the moment comfort was threatened. The neighbors would keep whispering. Guard Pascoe would keep showing up with his protocol and his mustache. The city was not going to change. The question was what he was going to do inside the city that wasn't going to change. He went to the storage room door and knocked 3 times, because he had learned by osmosis that this was how it was done. Maella's voice, from the other side, with that specific quality of someone who is awake but was pretending not to be. "Come in." He opened the door. She was sitting on the blanket, the necklace in her hand. She had removed it and put it aside after the harbour scene, but was looking at it now, turning it between her fingers, the green stone pendant reflecting the candle. "I read the notebook," he said. She didn't answer. "You're staying," he said. Not as a question, as a statement of the thing that had already been decided, that only needed to be said out loud to be real. She looked at him for a long moment with those gold eyes that had seen so many things most people never see, and that were still there, open, without the full shield she had brought in on the day of the rain. "Ragorn will come back," she said. "Yes. Goldport won't be easy. It never was. I'm not easy. Neither is Thomas," he said. "We get along." Silence. The candle trembled. Myella looked at the necklace in her hand, then slowly put it back around her neck, not as a gesture of refusal, as a gesture of not yet, but this is no longer the goodbye it was. "You're going to regret this," she said. "Probably," he said. "But I regret a lot of things. One more doesn't change the inventory." She looked at him for a moment, then looked at the wall, in the direction of Thomas's room on the other side. "He dreams loudly when he's happy," she said. "Did you know that?" Henry stood still. No, he hadn't known. He had heard Thomas make sounds in his sleep, but had always read it as restlessness, the kind of nocturnal unease of a child who carries too much while awake. "When he's well," said Maela, low voice. "He hums. Softly, no defined melody. It's the way his body releases what got stuck during the day." Henry stood still and listened to the night. And then he heard it. It had been there all along, so low it was almost part of the silence. Thomas's tiny voice, from the room next door, humming without words, without direction, the kind of sound that doesn't know it's making itself. Happy. Henry looked at Myella. She wasn't smiling. It wasn't a smiling moment. It was a moment for something else, quieter, more permanent, the face of someone who has found, after a long time lost, the place where the guard can lower by an inch, and the world doesn't charge for it. "Good night, Myella," he said. "Good night, Henry." He closed the door, went back to the kitchen, picked up the notebook, went to the shelf where he kept the important documents, contracts, receipts, Thomas's birth certificate, the house deed, and placed the notebook among them, because that was what it was, a document, evidence, a record of something that had happened in that house that nobody had planned and that didn't need a name yet, because the things that truly matter usually need time to know what name they carry. Outside, Gulport kept being Gulport. In here, for the first time in 18 months, there was more than one person on watch, and there was a boy humming in his sleep. Blood makes you orc, pain makes you human, but choosing to build is what makes you family.